engaging number of moments, we can't predict the player's path, and everything is permitted. Can we take steps to move forward to achieve the goal of engaging, meaningful, suspenseful open-world games, or is the concept a myth? Who am I? I'm Jesse Scoble. Thank you for coming. I have been working in video games for about 13 years, and games in total for about 18 years now. I've been at Ubisoft Montreal for the past 2 years, working on such open-world games as Watchdogs 2, Assassin's Creed Origins, Far Cry 5. Previous to that, I worked on games like Wizard 101, Armored Warfare, Webkinz, so it's quite a range. And before that, I worked in pen and paper games for about 5 years, in all sorts of various titles. So, in broadest terms, these are the kinds of games I want to talk about today. Games where you can go anywhere, do anything, or sandbox, and have a nonlinear approach to the story. If you want to figure out where these games started from, if you ask, say, 100 developers what the first open world game was, you'll probably get an answer like this. Colossal Cave Adventure, 1976, inspired free roaming games like Adventure. Or you might get an answer like Ultima 1, or the Space Simulator Elite, or you might get some answers like this. But really, what we're talking about are games like these today. Now, when I first did this presentation at MIGS in Montreal last November, I worked with a colleague, Russell Lees, and we sat down with a lot of our other colleagues in different disciplines, other writers, but also game designers, AI people, audio, and asked them their concerns for open world games. And these conversations really spiraled quickly into many different topics, and lots of stuff that is way outside of what a writer can focus on. So he and I worked to kind of shepherd this into looking at it from a writer's point of view. That's our expertise, that's what we do. So we brought it down into several big topics. Story shape, the dramatic structure, character, defining arcs and relationships, world coherence, themes and open world events, and the illusion of life, grab bag of stuff that makes the world feel real. Or verisimilitude, which I was worried to mispronounce. So looking at story shape, the first category raises the question, what is the shape or structure of our story? Most of us are familiar with classic structure, going back from Aristotle, tracing a line through Joseph Campbell, Sid Field, Robert McKee, very much baked into the hero's journey. And a lot of earlier story games took cues from film and TV. Those linear experiences can be very powerful. Talking about games like Max Payne, Batman Arkham Asylum, Last of Us, those types of things, Half-Life and Portal, those types of things create really, really significant moving stories. It's worth pointing out here that the hero's journey is a very traditional male-centric point of view, and it's beyond the scope of my talk today, but I want to at least take a moment to acknowledge that a number of people are doing work on the heroine's journey, feeling that the older styles didn't adequately address the psycho-spiritual journey of women. We're trying to, in some ways, break out of the sexist, reductive models of women as mother or goddess or temptress. And it's pretty clear that there have been many wildly successful examples recently in film, TV, and games of strong female characters, very, very rich characters, and I think it's worth just thinking about. So when we're talking about linear stories, one of the risks is that we can feel like we're being railroaded, and it can work against the sense of player agency. If we want to look at something like Homer's Odyssey as a game story, so to tell you about the Odyssey, okay, to sum up the Odyssey. After the fall of Troy, Odysseus wants to return to Ithaca and regain his rightful place as king alongside his wife, Penelope. On the way home, they're captured by the Cyclops. After narrowly escaping, they blind their captor, but while they're doing so, as they get on their ship to leave, Odysseus foolishly tells the Cyclops who he really was. Like, haha, as the first of many player-centric mistakes that will haunt us for games for a long time. In so doing, the Cyclops is able to call out to his father Poseidon and basically curse Odysseus. So it takes Odysseus 10 years of adventures and harrowing journeys to get home and set things right. Now, if we're going to break this down into a game structure, it might look something like this. First, you have events like he and his crew meet Kirke, the sorceress, who turns his crew to swine. Later on, they go by the sirens, to walk them, the temptresses. They have to pass Scylla and Charybdis, the monsters, and eventually get back home where he has an archery contest and kills all these suitors after his wife, etc. If this was an open world game, it might look a bit more like this, where you can kind of go in any direction. You can start to do one quest, maybe you finish it, you can do them in any order. It doesn't really matter which sequence you do to some degree. So one of the things we found is that it helps players to have a relatively easily identified main goal or golden path to connect to. For example, in Assassin's Creed Origins, Bayek's quest for vengeance really drives him. In Horizon Zero Dawn, Aloy wants to kind of solve the mystery of the world. In Far Cry Primal, Takar wants to build a village. If you're breaking this down into kind of the quest structure for your game, it might look a little bit like this. Parts may be gated mechanically, which is to say, like, this area is too high level for you, or you need a grappling hook or a wingsuit or whatever to get to that thing. Until you achieve that thing in the game, you can't go there. Or they may be gated somewhat dramatically for story purposes. If you haven't met a character, obviously you can't reveal much about them at that stage. And it's obvious, but it's important to think about when we're writing these things. But one of the things, especially on the mechanical side, keeping things restricted, is these days, it seems especially, some designers are worried about kind of gating the fun. They want to have as much open from the get-go. For Watchdogs 2, we had a much less linear format. The idea is that non-linear gives you more freedom. And you had a number of main quests that you could do roughly in any order, but as you completed enough of them, it would advance the story at these kind of funnel points. The importance of structure is that it obviously ensures logic, and it allows you to incorporate emotional payoff. Sometimes, of course, you don't want to make it super clear how the structure is the player, but this is sort of the general way we're looking at it. For Origins, the early part of the game was much more linear at first, until you hit kind of the end of Act 1, and then you learned about the hunt, until you had all these targets open up on your map, and you could go and do any region in any order, but eventually it funneled back towards a much more linear end point. So as you would enter a region and kind of follow the main path, we would introduce you to a number of side quests, activities, things along that nature, some of which would be chained to each other, so you would have to do part 1 of a side quest and part 2, obviously. But many that you could just do as you encountered them, letting the player really define things as they wanted to go forward. Most recently, Far Cry 5, I've been very appreciative of this structure, where once you finish the introduction, the map opens up into 3 big regions that, again, you can do in any order, but there are different activities in each region. There's basically main path quests, outposts that you can liberate, smaller activities, and finally side quests. The side quests tend to not move the main storyline forward, but the main path would give you a lot of points on your resistance meter. You could actually watch this thing go forward. Outposts were single event. You could do them once, or you liberate an outpost, but it gives you a good medium chunk of points, raising the resistance meter. Whereas the activities were things like destroying cult structures, rescuing hostages, killing important VIP kind of bosses and mini bosses in the level. You could do this pretty much as many times as you wanted, and each would give you a little bit of points, raising the resistance meter. When the resistance meter hit certain thresholds, it would trigger a big story event, and really the whole story kind of takes a big step forward. And I really like this because it feels like no matter, you can approach the game however you want, whether you're following the main path exclusively or mostly staying on secondary stuff, but you still feel connected to the world, to the story as a whole. There are lots of examples of open world games where people sort of abandon the main quest completely and just do their own thing. And that's great, that's perfectly valid style, but it's less about making a powerful story than ever before. So when we were going through this process, one of the stranger lessons learned was taken from the game designers. I think this came out of Watchdogs 2 originally, where you'd end a quest and it would end on like a really suspenseful cliffhanger, and players were going to rush to figure out the next part of the story. They would, hey, I gotta go get that guy, I gotta solve this thing, I gotta do it. And the designers worked and said, "Whoa, wow, players are they're racing forward. They're not doing all the side quests and these cool activities and all these other things. They're not spending enough time in the world. Can you slow it down a little bit? Can you not end on a suspenseful note?" Which seems counterintuitive, right, from storytelling purposes. So what we've learned to do, to some degree, is to try to find ways of ending things where it's less ending on a cliffhanger at the end of a quest, and more leaving some threads that you can still follow. It's, a few dangling kind of plot hooks. So at the beginning of AC Origins, Bayek thinks he's got the final guy he's already got to kill, and he does it. And in the Assassin's Creed games, when you kill your main enemies, you get to have a shared moment in the White Room, this space where you're able to have kind of dramatic exchange with them, despite the fact that they've been killed. And we wanted, this was the first hour or so of the game, so obviously there's 80 more hours in the game. Everybody knows there's more game coming. But we didn't want the player to feel like to rush forward. So the target gives a few cryptic comments, which were enough that when Bayek, the player reconnects with his wife Aya, they're able to talk about it and she's like, "Hey, you did it great, we're done." He's like, "No, he said something a little bit weird. I want to follow up on it." And it gives the players enough sort of threads that they can kind of spread out into different quests, different ways they want to do things. But if they want to explore the world a little bit now, they also don't feel compelled that they have to immediately follow the next step of it. Of course, when we're talking about bigger structure and some of those funneling and kind of climatic points, yes, sometimes you're going to want to push things forward. And you can do things quite often, towards the last act of a game, you'll get the warning like, "Oh, if you do this, you won't be able to do any side quests for a while," or whatever. And those are fine, but those are tools that should be used very sparingly. Because I think they obviously they break immersion but it's still important to give the player some sense of how things are unfolding. Another element of kind of keeping quests shorter is that you don't want them to feel guilty for engaging in some of the side activities and content that you've got, like playing Gwent, or in Far Cry 3, where Jason Brody has to go save his friends who are being held by horrible, horrible terrorists, but maybe he wants to go hunting, or do a yacht race. Yeah, I should save them, I guess they'll be fine, Also with larger story arcs, because players can kind of weave more in and out of the quests, you may sort of lose connection, they can sort of lose the plot. So there's a moment in Watchdogs 2 where the main bad guy, he really pulls a number on on Marcus and his whole hacker team. He really plays them, and they all feel like this guy's way better, way smarter than them, and they all feel just beat down and horrible. And they say, like, "Hey, we need to regroup at our hacker space. Come back, basically telling the player, come back to the headquarters and we'll figure something out." So I was going back, and I was like, "Well, hey, there's a perk point over there, an ability point. I want to go get one of those things. I need to boost some skills. And, oh, hey, there's a cool racing thing here I hadn't seen, and I did some other things." And the world of Watchdogs is very delightful, so I was kind of doing a bunch of little things. And I'm like, "Yeah, I guess I should go back." And I come in, I'm like, "Hey, how's everybody?" "Oh, everyone's really sad." "Oh, why is everyone?" "Oh, yeah, that mainline thing where we got beaten, but I totally forgot about that for a few moments." And so when you try to avoid this kind of dissonance, it's good to have little reminders, trying to think about how the player may disengage from the main story for a little bit, and try to find little tricks to kind of onboard them back as they return to it. So, for example, in a lot of soap operas, there's a lot of redundant dialogue reminding you what happened last week or what happened the time before. So you don't want to obviously hit players over the head with this kind of thing, because that can get very annoying. And I think we talked about frequency and repetition in Alex's talk this morning. But if you can do things like follow the player's progression, this is a heat map. Some of you may have seen things like this. So they work really well in some studios have tools where you can track where players are moving in the game, obviously what they're doing, how many quests they're doing. So if there's a sense of the player hasn't touched the main quest in 5 hours or 10 hours, maybe you give them a little gentle reminder. Maybe it's a phone call. Maybe it's some bit of voiceover. Some ways of reminding them and kind of reorienting them. So just to recap quickly on story shape, so there's trade-offs of linear stories where you can sometimes have more obviously crafted emotional impact versus player freedom, and our sort of limited or quick best practices. So our second big category was character arcs, or how to build a protagonist. So your protagonist is obviously your entry point to your story. And there seem to be two major categories. There are really defined characters or empty shells. So defined character has, backstory, motivations, wants, needs. It eases the friction if you can align the player with what the player wants with what the character wants. Otherwise, what the player chooses to spend their time doing may work against the story. So for example, as I said in Far Cry 3, if you want to go do things other than save your friends, you may feel a little guilty that you're not doing it. In The Witcher, Geralt wants to hunt monsters for money. Well, luckily most players want to hunt monsters for money, so really well. Marcus in Watchdogs wants to sort of hack for the lulz, and slowly starts kind of developing a desire to hack for purpose. So as he does little kind of fun, goofier missions, they start to fall into having a greater sense of working against the big data corporations. So when we were working on Bayek for AC Origins, we really needed to figure out who the character was and what made him tick. There was an old idea about making him a priest or a healer, which I think is a great concept, but the mechanics that we had to deal with were the Assassin's Creed mechanics, which don't really support healing and being a priest. They support killing people. Without having to kind of throw everything out and redesign, which I think you could do, but that's a much more ambitious step one in pre-production. We needed to come up with a role for him to explore the world and also want to help all of these sort of helpless NPCs and work with things. And we came across the idea of a Medjay as a cross between sort of an elite police force and an old-time sheriff. It gave him a role and purpose. It was one that players could easily identify with. It was a player fantasy that players could easily grasp. So he's given this, so he's kind of old-time sheriff, he's got this quest for vengeance. The player runs into an area in the Nile area, or Bernagi, anyway, where he comes across the Hippodrome, and we wanted to introduce the idea of chariot racing. So, because chariot racing could be an activity that player could spend all sorts of time doing, we wanted to justify this at least lightly, narratively. Why does the player want to do this thing? So we talked about maybe he just wants to do it to earn money to fund his quest for vengeance. And I mean, that was okay, but not really great. Didn't really feel like it fit the character. Didn't feel like it really felt mechanics of the game, and it didn't really feel like it would make sense for him to spend weeks or months becoming the champion of the Hippodrome, just to get money to fuel his vengeance quest. So we decided to wrap a story around it. And when he's passing through the area, he runs into a boyhood friend, Claridus. At first it acts as a lighter story moment from his heavy burden. It's a bit funny. It gives a little bit of character building as they talk about their past. But a night of heavy drinking brings up old rivalries and deep-seated resentments between these two guys. Obviously, they had a lot of history. And in the end, Bayek and the player are both left with wanting to prove that they are better than Claridus in the arena. Now, it's the type of thread that if a player doesn't want to do it, moves on. That's great. They've got the vengeance quest. But if they want to go and do the chariot racing, it tied them nicely into it. So, Marcus Holloway, he's about 24 years old. He was a delightful character. He's a lot of fun to watch, a lot of fun to play, which is great. I think he's a really strong character design. However, playing Marcus can lead to moments of dissonance when you crack heads or shoot someone in the face. Often, especially in games like Watchdogs, when stealth fails, you may have had no other option other than a shootout to get out of things. The idea of having him, rack up his tremendous body count doesn't necessarily fit with the character profile as envisioned. So, I mean, it raises these questions of should we have changed the narrative? Should we have made him, more violent? Maybe. Could we have worked with the designers if we had had a bit more time to come up with a greater suite of non-lethal weapons and really kind of push more of the stealth things? I think that would also be great. There are no easy answers with these things, and quite often writers don't have control over enough things in the production. So you have to make compromises and find what is acceptable. But it's certainly, I want to leave us with, gray areas are good. I think it's really good to have the option of calling in cops on a gang or calling in two gangs to fight each other, giving the player the decision, how does this feel? There's enough room in the character to make those choices. So contrasting the more defined characters, we have the empty shell. So it raises the question of, is this yourself that you're playing in the game? Is it a hybrid? This type of character allows more immediacy and diversity, while simultaneously increasing the risk of losing the character. Empty shells, may or may not be mute. You may have voice choices, you may have or dialogue choices and branching. But often they feel like more of a witness to other people's stories, watching the world unfold. It's a little bit more similar to MMO storytelling, where the same story has to work for thousands or millions of the chosen one. One of the good things about this, though, is that players cannot play the game wrong. If you choose to have a more violent character or a more passive character, or a character who never raises a gun or never rides horses or whatever, you can do that, and it doesn't, it's not just dictated by the game narrative. So, in defining characters, we want the players to feel something. Game designer Robin Laws has published a new theory of story techniques. While his focus is on tabletop games, some of it seems very relevant to our work in video games. By giving the players agency, we create a story space that is much more improvised and collaborative than in traditional novels, films, and comics. Thus, our stories have an innate messiness. And that messiness gives us a lot of freedom, I think. If our stories aren't perfect, players are very forgiving because they have agency and they get to shape it themselves. Robin's book is more focused on moment-to-moment transitions. He defines it as beat analysis. While we like to think our characters, and we ourselves, are capable of a wide range of emotions, he argues that two emotions rule all others. We hope that the situation at hand will resolve favorably for the protagonist, and we fear that it won't. We don't either hope or fear for the characters, we don't care what's going on, and the game is lost. Both responses can be overdone. Too much hope or confidence, and we become complacent and bored. Too much fear, and we surrender to despair and disengage. The rapid yet unpredictable alternation of hope and fear keeps us on the edge of our seats. So we tend to think of characters' arcs in literary or screenwriting terms, how they change over the course of the story. This classic structure is something you're probably familiar with. His beat analysis is quite different. It's more like a wave of upward and downward movement and short moments. Remember I was talking earlier about having short quests, short beats. This plays into this a lot. The overall movement is downward, but there are continual ticks up and down along the way as players overcome various challenges and you increase the threat and the level. Hero meets a series of obstacles, overcoming some, and being overcome by others in some cases. When you think about compelling narratives, the downward slope of emotion makes sense. They spend much of their time increasing your sense of tension and anxiety, especially at the end, before relieving it in a sudden upward sweep at the conclusion. So in addition to making your player and character feel hope and fear, a strong way of defining them is building attachments to allies and villains. Good villains make for good stories, but there are a lot of challenges in getting to know the villain. Quite often we feel like we need to create some sense of distance so the player doesn't immediately go up and try to kill them or get killed in response. In AC Origins, we used a mind's eye theater solution where when someone would talk about a villain, we would cut to a cinema of them for a moment. There's obviously techniques of found videos or sound files, flashbacks. The antagonist may be present, but you can't kill them, or you see them from afar. In Bioshock, they did a great job with hearing Frank Fontaine's voice in your ear. So there's a lot of little tricks. Some of the more, one of the more really interesting ones for me was the Joker in Batman Arkham Knight. So Batman gets poisoned and he starts hallucinating the Joker. And this was brilliantly done. Now, I think it certainly helps that we're very familiar with Joker and Batman and the relationship, but you would constantly turn around doing something completely unrelated and the Joker would suddenly appear there. And the animations were great. He was just naturally dropped into a scene. He would say something very unsettling or work at you, and if you tried to engage him, he just vanished, or if you turned, he would just vanish. And these hallucinations would also play into the world around you and some of the environmental storytelling. You might see, a traditional billboard like this, and then have a moment of sort of hallucination where it would be revealed to be more like that. Alex Horn, in his Emergence talk this morning, talked a lot about Shadows of Mordor, the Nemesis system. The Nemesis system creates very strong attachments to what might otherwise be throwaway NPCs. Remembering just a few key details makes it feel like the world is reacting to you. That attachment plus emergent gameplay is a very powerful tool. And it's really what helped make that game really stand out for me. I think one of the areas where you see the world not react around you is where when the main story is not as strong, and so you end up kind of playing smaller little stories. I think Alex talked about his nemesis was really the guy he wanted to get versus the mouth of Sauron, and I felt very much the same way. One of the other really clever things about that was because you are a spirit that's reanimated, your deaths are part of the game, and so it totally makes sense for you to die and come back. It's not like the game's resetting, and so it works great for that. So on the flip side of villains, friends and allies. We often build them in side quests. AC Origins had Tahira, you meet in the Nile area. She's again a person you had met in previous time, or she's from your past, I should say. And so it's kind of a shorthand for creating a quick relationship between them. In Watchdogs, Marcus has DedSec all around him, and pretty much everyone in The Witcher that you meet is somebody that Geralt knows from the past game or two and builds on. But talking about The Witcher, one of the interesting tools I found was being able to have an alternate point of view and play as Ciri. One of the really cool things about this for me was I knew in the mainline plot I had to rescue her, but being able to play as her, I realized she wasn't in immediate mortal peril danger. She's pretty damn capable. So again, I didn't feel guilty if I was doing side quests or smaller things or whatever. I knew that she was, she was taking care of herself. I still had to save her, but there was definitely this space for it. And creating or allowing the player to play alternate point of views brings some interesting ideas to the world, right? Lets you see different elements of it. In AC Origins, you can play as Aya. In AC Syndicate, you can switch between Evie and Jacob. Obviously, games like GTA 4 have multiple points of view characters. So these kinds of strong, defined characters help really establish your protagonist and help you feel grounded and connected to the world. This is important, I think, when you have a world that you can explore in so many different ways and kind of your choice. So creating a coherent world. So as I mentioned with AC Origins, there was the issue of the chariot racing. How do we kind of justify this and make it feel connected? In Watchdogs, so there's yacht racing. Now, Marcus doesn't really seem like much of a yacht racing guy. I don't seem like much of a yacht racing guy. But there were yachts in the game, they were ships, and racing is a very easy mechanic. And the game designer's like, well, of course we're gonna have racing. It's really easy. It takes like 2 minutes to put in. It'd be criminal not to have it in the game. So I think the way it's introduced is there's very charismatic, kind of zany character who creates that moment. So it's sort of hanging a lantern on a little bit, but helps create a bit of a narrative wrapper to justify it in the world that you've got. So another key element of creating a coherent world is having a theme that unites the world and the actions. So the theme helps tell a resonant story. A good theme lets you explore a world from different angles. In GTA 4, revenge is pretty much an all-encompassing theme. And almost all the missions you do are revenge-based. Many of them are revenge-based. And they almost all go wrong in some way, or for somebody in there, not necessarily for you. It gets to the point where in the end, you have a choice of kind of taking revenge yourself, and you have to decide whether you've learned from all these other cases of it not going well, or whether you want to kind of grab hold of it and strangle it. knowing that it's probably not going to end well for the character. So it's a very kind of powerful component. AC Origins, Vengeance was a strong driving component as well, but we had the idea of parenting or a parent-child relationship as a very strong component. And there were lots of moments where it would be reflected in major or minor ways as you went through it, dealing with side quests and some of the characters you would see, or certainly influence our writing as to ways of reflecting upon biased relationships. Also with Origins, we had regional themes. So the Nile region, for example, was kind of governed by the theme of man versus nature. So many of the quests were dealt with, either kind of going out and there were like Roman hunters that you could fight against that were poaching. They were basically collecting animals to take back for the slaughter in the big games. Or there was, built on the same theme, there was a city that was taken over by the desert that one man is trying to rebuild. It's basically his big construction project is to reclaim the city. It's a very different take on man versus nature, but it fit completely within that context. So in some of Ubisoft's older days, you would climb a tower to unlock a region, reveal a bunch of quest icons on the map. Far Cry 5 has a much more organic way of exposing you to the world. There are things like Animal Crossing signs, which reveal hunting areas, rescued NPCs that reveal treasure stashes, mission locations, etc., as well as letters, recordings that can be used to blend environmental storytelling with mission design. So there was sort of a hierarchy when you encountered, not so much animal sign, but a rescued NPC or something. It would basically do a check. Have you heard about this mainline mission yet? If no, what's the next category? Have you heard about this outpost to liberate? Have you heard about this thing? And it was geographically based. So you were hearing about little bits of the world as you explored it in a way that feels really organic and really good to me. So try to align your role activities, have some theme, and definitely communicate with other teams to incorporate all of these elements as you can. So, illusion of life, world reactivity and persistence. When we're talking about world reactivity, there's a lot that goes in with the AI teams, trying to make the world aware of the player. Obviously things like conditional barks are great. NPCs commenting on what you've done, what you could do, what you might do are very good. Games like Oblivion, GTA Mafia had radio calls, but again, as Alex mentioned in his talk earlier, the idea of frequency is a key instrument in this. You want it to feel natural and interesting and not be repetitive and beat the player over the head. You don't want to hear that you've done this thing 30 times in a row. So trying to make sure that it works on the tech side for that. Not that that's often the writer's job, but it's important that the writer works with those teams to make sure that that is at least discussed and trying to incorporate. Too much or too little can be dangerous. As we explore these open worlds, sometimes the requests we get from different teams can cause a friction within our jobs. So there was an example in Origins where Bayek was working with, had helped some people out, and they wanted to go chase some bandits down, and they want the player to come with them and go after the bandits. So the designer said to me, okay, write some dialogue where you say, hey, ride with us after the bandits. So I wrote it, fine. Sent off their review, okay, this is good. But we don't want to dictate to the player that you have to get a horse and you have to ride. So why don't you say, come with me as we ride after the bandits. Okay, fine, so I revised it. Okay, well, this is good. But the AI has been a little unpredictable, it's systemic, we can't really control what they do necessarily. They might not take horses, all the horses might be killed. So can you just change it to, come with me after the bandits? Okay, that's fine. But if I had known from the beginning more of what the heart of the matter was, I could have tried to create something that was evocative and flavorful, but that also avoided being really prescriptive to telling the player what they had to do. It's a fine balance, and when you're in the midst of a production and lots of people are working on other things, you can't always have the time and distance to think about this. But they certainly didn't mean for me to make my writing more bland, but I also didn't want them to have writing that didn't work, or the players would think, well, this doesn't make sense. too many of those moments create break the illusion of what the game is, right? So persistence. One of the big things with these open world games is, can the world change? So in Shadows of Mordor, as I mentioned, I felt that no matter how many thousands or millions of orcs I killed, that I was never making any progress. Games where there's more territorial control, in a Far Cry where you can liberate an outpost and feel like the map is changing, I think are very powerful tools for the player that you feel things are progressing, like you're making a real impact. However, a lot of these games are built on the idea that players are going to ideally invest 60, 80, 100 hours, whatever, into it. And quite often when you get to the end, you don't necessarily want to turn all the world off. You don't want to turn all the villain, the challenges off. So we struggle with kind of deciding, are we an MMO where these things have to be, persistent and remain in the world, or can we actually make effective change? Sometimes, I think in Far Cry 3 or 4, you could redo the outposts as much as you wanted, because the outpost gameplay was great. It didn't really make any sense on a story side, but it was a good game mechanic, good gameplay thing. So trying to balance those things out is a bit tricky. And when you get to the end of games, quite often again, it's a question of how much can you go back and do all those side quests that you didn't do. Can you do that, or have you achieved some ending or some change in the world state where you can't do that anymore? One of the stories I wanted to mention about on AI reactivity. So again, talking about dissonance and we're trying to incorporate all these different conditions and triggers, and you want NPCs to be as believable as you can. So there was a case in an earlier Far Cry, I think it was 3, where a playtester was experimenting with the outpost and fire propagation. They came to an outpost and they burned the thing down and just destroyed everything. And then they hid in the bushes. They wanted to see how the world would react to it. So they're hanging out, and after a few minutes, there was a guard that was attached to it, but in a really long scouting circuit. He finally comes around and he sees the place is burned down, and he goes through his, goes from yellow to orange to red threat level. Oh no, there's a bad guy around here. I gotta deal with it. And then the player just waits. And then he starts to calm down because the cooldown is, and triggers the, must have been a bird. Just walks off. So, those are really funny moments, but not always the best for the strongest narrative beats. It is a war a little bit between emergent and systemic and open world and shaping and controlling the narrative experience players have. Some players care very deeply about these things. Some don't, and that's perfectly fine. There's a whole range of them. But we should certainly, because clarity and consistency in the narrative vision brings the whole game together. I keep referring to Alex's talk. One of the things he also touched on, which I kind of want to end with, is is there some sort of platonic ideal of what an open world game would be? And sort of yes and sort of no. I think as he touched upon, games like Dungeons and Dragons, where the world is truly reactive in a sense to the players, who can go in any direction, but it is still kind of contained and controlled. I think is where we would love to go, but time, technology, resources, all of those things, limit us a little bit right now. So we're still kind of playing around and trying to find that out. So, thank you very much. As I said, it was presented by, it was created by myself and Russell Lees. He would love to hear from you. And there's definitely time for some questions if anyone has. Back.
You talked about the reactive world thing. I'm wondering if there's any work being done with some of that artificial intelligence, like Watson, IBM's Watson, things like that, that dynamically shape the world based on player actions in a less integrated way, but more like a remote server shapes your local world.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not very familiar with the AI side of things and some of the Watson deep learning stuff. I do think it's remarkable, in the 2 years or so that I've been working at Ubisoft, that with Watchdogs 2, there were lots of issues about if an NPC dropped a gun or a coffee cup or something, it was too heavy on the system resources to sort of maintain ownership of it, so it would basically be lost. And also, things that we often don't think about as a writer is if the item drops to the ground, or it drops here, or drops on the table, that might be 3 different animations that may or may not be in the bank. So quite often it was too crippling on the system side to incorporate that. On the other hand, the talk that Dr. Paul gave yesterday on AI and deep learning, and the idea of where self-driving cars are today and how they recognize, we're working towards recognizing intent of people crossing the street and so forth, pedestrian intent. I think we're going to make some huge progress, in very short order as to how we can manage these things. I know Origins had a much bigger cast of NPCs in the world, and again, this is kind of beyond my ken. But at a certain sort of range, they basically the graphics kind of are despawned, and there's sort of a tag that just sort of operates in the world, and they stay on schedules and things, but don't necessarily, don't require as heavy resources, and they're able to kind of go much farther than that. Schedules for NPCs is another big topic I didn't really touch on today, but where quite often at the beginning of a project, when it's sort of blue skying it, you want everyone to feel alive in the world, and they're all doing their little tasks and things. And then when you start actually play testing and where is this guy, where's this quest giver, and they kind of wandered off, and then someone says, no, we have to fix them at this location, and then I go back to changing my dialogue from he could be anywhere to no, he's there. It's very good fun. So, Alex?
Yeah, thank you, Justin. So, have you had any experience in Origins or on Watchdogs or anything where you had any conflict between themes for smaller chunks of content, bumping up against the limitations of a zone, an area that it has to be combined into
Sorry, can you speak a little bit?
Yeah, sorry. So I'm saying, have you had any issues where you had themes for a smaller area of content, like you have a zone, and it has some side missions in it or some side quests or something, and the zone is supposed to have theme, overall thematic flavor to it, and the constraints of that feeling at all gamey when it's now you cross the street and now it's a whole completely different theme
Sure.
type of thing.
Sure. So if I can recount. Trying to incorporate a theme into it, are we kind of limited by it, or is it problematic if you want to have, things that don't fit the theme within, or to have 2 themes that are very different, in kind of crossing that border? Yeah. So I think it depends really much on the game and the vision of it. A game like Far Cry, I think, incorporates a much better mix of really, really serious and really, really zany. It's just the nature of the brand. With Origins, one of the next zones over dealt with the corruption of the priesthood, I think, and so it had quests like you went into the market and you found these fake cat mummies that were being made and sold to tourists that were coming through on the lowest level, and went through corruption all the way to the top of the priesthood. But to me, that's still within the world context. It still fits within the greater themes of the world of Egypt at that time, and the different sort of classes, and dealing with sort of Bayek's role as kind of defender of the pharaoh and sort of his ties to the priesthood and his role in the world. I think they can if they're done really ham-handed, but most of the time we try to have them as a more subtle element. I mean, maybe it worked, maybe it didn't, but I think that it's, again, they were less sort of on the nose, and so they more sort of shaped us inspired us rather than really felt all of the missions in here have to deal with X or Y. And I mean, again, there's still only so many types of missions and actions that the character can take. So there's a lot of fighting people and killing people no matter what zone you're in. So
I know that for open worlds, you often have a lot of quests, and you did touch up a lot on the quests that exist on the side quests. But besides maybe having the character, like in Assassin's Creed Origins, being someone who goes out and helps people, what are good ways to keep side quests from really breaking the main quest, if that makes sense, because you still want to flow, but you also want players to be interested in doing side quests.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so it's, to recap, so how do you keep side quests from breaking the main story? Is that one of them? So again, having, building in breathing moments, keeping even your mainline quests relatively short and contain beats, gives the player the chance to explore the world in greater extent at kind of their own pace. And as they find those moments that engage them and interest them, they can take them on. Again, I would say you would want things that fit within the thematic and creative vision of the world, ideally. And obviously, lots of these games have Easter eggs or touchstones or little moments where things bend or kind of bend the fourth wall, if not necessarily break it. But that's really depends on the game and the style that you feel is appropriate to it. Guy behind you. You.
Yes. So when you have a branching narrative, players enjoy it when the choices you make have an impact on later actions and so forth. But of course, it's impossible for every narrative choice to have real impact further on.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the times you have a player choice and that affects the narrative, but in the end it all comes back to the same place. Like Telltale does that quite well. What would you say is the best ratio between sort of false choices and real choices that have a lasting impact?
So to recap, what is the best ratio between false choices and real choices? So Carrie Patel gave a great talk on branching narrative earlier, and I should say I'm really glad that she covered that. It's a bit beyond my expertise and obviously not the subject, but I think between her covering that and Alex's on emergence, we hit a whole bunch of great stuff on narrative. False choice is a tricky one. I think if there's something that you're doing with it, that you're still defining the character and you're sort of giving the player a role-playing chance, and you feel like you're building something about your take on this character, I think that's pretty valid. I think games where there's lots of dialogue options or choices, where there is no real, they all end up kind of channeling back in the same spot, I question sort of the amount of work that goes in versus the payoff. It's not really my favorite kind of style of things. So I think you really want to work to make, if you have a game that has choice, those choices to be significant and to feel resonant to the player. We had one case on one of these games where, I mean, this is not exactly true, but or not exactly as relevant, but if you did the mission, stealthy, there would be 5 guards at the next point. But if you did it really noisy, there would be 10 guards. And there was no way to telegraph the player. It was like an ambush or something that came up. We're like, why are we twisting ourselves to try to express this in a way like it doesn't? The player's not going to care, And if the player's not going to care what the difference is, they're just going to engage the guys. Then don't give yourself extra work for it. Try to find those moments that are significant in a way where the player can feel that they may not know exactly how it's going to play out, but they have some sense that it is. And I think really lean into those. You mentioned Telltale, and one of their little, Jesse will remember that. It's such a great tool. Whether it really works or not, I always feel like it's a really significant moment. Time for a couple more in the back.
So you talked about fully defined characters versus like empty shell characters, but could you suggest some games that take a more middle ground where they sort of like support and hold the player character in their role playing, like in D&D where you like role playing a certain character and you get penalties for doing something you would never do based on that?
Yeah. So what are some games that present a hybrid of that choice?
Yeah.
I think that things like Fallout does. I mean, I think games where you are giving the player, whether it's you may not have a literal voice, but whether you have dialogue options where you're able to define that, but you're still within kind of the structure of what you're trying to do as the main quest in Fallout 3 or Fallout 4. I think that blends it a little bit. I think you have to find, I guess there are different roles there. In Far Cry 5, your character has a definite role in the world as you're this rookie deputy, but we didn't want to give the character a voice and a defined face and name as previous Far Cry's, to give it a greater sense of this immediacy, right? To let you kind of play into it. I think it's a very delicate balance, and something that kind of the team has to agree on a kind of higher, creative level, what story they want to tell and what they want to kind of play with, give the players a chance to kind of explore and move forward. Anything else?
Just a thought of some of the, kind of triggered off some of what people were saying. What do you think about the idea of a quest line that isn't resolvable in the success sort of way? I'm kind of like you're sent out to get the 5 rats, but there are no rats, and there never will be. And it's more about giving the player something that he can chase until he decides not to.
I mean, I think if there is no way to achieve the quest, players will be very frustrated. I think it's different from having quests that have fail conditions or things that have a time element. One of the things that we had talked about a little bit was the idea of, again, the sort of a living world. Games like Animal Crossing do this really, really well, where there are certain quests or activities that are only available at very specific times, and if you miss that window, I mean, that's it. I guess it eventually will repeat. I think that's been an interesting style especially for side quests and things. You wouldn't really want to do it for main quests. I don't think you want to frustrate the players. That's not a very great idea. But also, even if an NPC who's on the main line says, "Hey, meet me at the bridge," and if you then spend 5 hours not going to the bridge, it might be interesting if you went there and they're not there, and someone else is like, "Hey, they got tired of waiting for you. They're back at their house," where the system recognizes, it's like a line of irritated dialogue, but where they, you've acknowledged what the player's doing, right? I think that's very powerful.
An aspect too, incorporated something like that, where depending on how you did the story missions, something would happen to your ship's crew, they'd be taken, depending on what point of the story you were in. If you hadn't finished all the other side missions, helping like your main crew out, your team to storm the base, by the time you got to the crew, if you had taken so long to get to them, the crew would be dead for the most part. Or it's just like they may not all be dead, but more and more it's just like depending on where you were at in the quest and how long you took time to get to them, there would be serious consequences. It's not necessarily a failure because your main crew would hopefully survive, but it would show the consequence
Right.
of what the player chose in the game.
Yeah, I think if you have the bandwidth to have some quests that can be failed, can be a very powerful tool. But you don't want to say create something where the player just can't do it, and I don't think I think that'll just create a lot of frustration. So thank you guys very much.